Hello everyone, welcome to Astera Psych, and today's video is a little bit special because instead of just explaining some concept to you, I'm actually going to be presenting a theory that I have worked on a little bit over the past few months and kind of thought of, and it's something that I think is actually really interesting in relation to MBTI and the cognitive functions. This is actually something that I wrote a blog post about on my website, asterapsych.com, and if you're interested in seeing this in writing form, you can go check out that blog post. I will include a link to it down in the description box below. The topic and the thing that I'm going to be presenting today is whether or not cognitive functions are masculine or feminine, or whether or not they can change between these two things, or if they have their own inherent nature associated with them. If you're familiar with the typology community, you may know that certain personality systems like objective personality, run by Dave and Shannon, use a cognitive function masculinity and femininity system. And I think that the way they go about doing it is not actually representative of what I'm seeing in cognitive function. So I wanted to present the theory that I believe to be the current best working model for cognitive function, masculinity, and femininity, and why I think that this is a good system for understanding cognitive functions. Let's get into it. So as I mentioned, it's really important to remember going into this video that this is entirely theoretical and I treat it as that. When I'm working with clients, for example, I don't use this current model as any form of assessment because this is just a working theory that I have in my head right now. I don't want you to treat anything I'm saying in this video as a fact in relation to cognitive functions or the Jungian functions in general. This is all just something that I have thought a lot about and I think is representative. One day I might move it forward into something a little bit more concrete, but for now I think it's best represented as just a kind of thought experiment and a way to view and understand cognitive functions. So let's get into the actual theory itself now. So the most important thing we need to do if we're going to explain this theory is make sure we get our definitions absolutely correct. When I'm referring to functions as masculine and feminine, this may be a good shortcut representation for the kind of things that I'm attempting to explain or reference, but I don't think masculine and feminine are actually the best terms for when we're referring to this inherent nature of cognitive functions. What I actually prefer to use and what I use in my blog post is the terms yin and yang. And if you're familiar with, what yin and yang is, most of you probably are, it is usually represented as dark and light, but the actual concepts that make up yin and yang are far deeper than that. For example, yin, which is dark, represents femininity, the unknown, dark, and chaos, while yang represents the known, order, light, and masculinity. And what this means is that instead of just talking about traditional masculinity and femininity, we're going to be talking about yin and yang concepts and how these relate to the functions themselves. So essentially, I believe that certain cognitive functions have an inherent yin nature or an inherent yang nature, which may encapsulate the concepts of masculinity and femininity, but are not purely represented by them alone. Another way to think about yin and yang is to think of yin as soft and moving, much like water. It's something that is not going to be as pushy or aggressive when it comes to how it interacts with the world because it represents more of that feminine side. It's soft and moving. Where when we think of yang, we think of hard, like stone. It's going to be something that's unmoving. It's going to be something that's pushy when it needs to get something. And it's going to be a lot more aggressive in its attempts to want to interact with the outer world. So when we think of yin and yang in relation to the functions, this leads me to my next point, and the kind of basis of the theory that I have is that cognitive functions don't have masculine and feminine forms. I believe that each cognitive function has its own inherent masculinity or femininity, or its own yin or yang nature associated with it. To understand how I came to this conclusion and why I think about cognitive functions in this way, we have to look at the building blocks of the cognitive functions. What are the individual parts that make up cognitive functions, and how do these define the masculinity and femininity of each of the functions? So the first thing that we need to look at when we're going to be defining the yin and yang nature of functions is extroversion and introversion, because these are associated with all 8 of the cognitive functions. So when we think of extroversion, we think of someone who's relatively outgoing. They're going to be interactive with the outer world more often. They're usually proactive with the things that they want to get in life. They're going to be willing to engage with the outer world to get the things that they want. Where when you look at introverted people, you usually see people who are more so in their own mind. They don't want to interact with the outer world unless they absolutely have to. They'd much prefer to interact with things on their own terms or do things their own way when it comes to achieving goals. When I look at extroversion, I think of something that is relatively yang or hard or masculine in nature. It's going to be more pushy, for example, than the introverted function or introverted axis, which is of a more so yin nature. Introversion represents more so that softness, that ability to adapt. It's going to be much more like water, where it's going to be not as active or aggressive like you might see with extroversion in certain situations. Now, this is going to vary depending on the function associated with that, and you'll see that as the theory continues down the line of how I explain the components that make it up. Next, we need to look at judging and perceiving. And when I say this, I don't mean J and P as the letters. I mean whether or not a function is actually a judging function, thinking or feeling, or a perceiving function, intuition and sensing. So Jung defined the judging functions as kind of rational and perceiving functions as irrational. And rational functions, again, the judging ones, thinking and feeling, are going to be the ones that are of a much more yang nature. They're hard, strict, and defined. When they have decided on something, that decision is usually going to stick, and they're usually going to be quite unmoving in whether or not they want to change their approach to how they're doing something. Now, perceiving functions tend to be a little bit more malleable because they want to gather new information and approach things from different angles, and they will only come to final decisions if they feel like they absolutely have to. This leads me to believe that perceiving functions are of a yin, soft, and feminine nature, and that the extroverted functions follow that yang nature. They're going to be much more hard and masculine. And this is another kind of clear-cut dichotomy when we look at how it portrays in people. So look at an EJ type versus an EP type. If you look at an EJ, most EJs are really direct and straightforward people. They lead with an extroverted judging function. They're going to be quite straightforward, and they're usually willing to say what's on their mind when it comes to getting the things that they want. They're going to be proactive. Now, EP types are relatively proactive as well, but the difference is that they're usually a little bit more malleable because they lead with a perceiving function. And perceiving is something that is a little bit more changing. It's a little bit more yin and soft. It's going to be something that's slightly more adaptable when it comes to new situations. And this leads me to believe that the judging functions are of a yang nature, while the perceiving functions are of a yin nature. Now that we've covered the elements that make up certain functions, we can cover the actual letters and functions themselves and how they relate to yin and yang. So let's look at thinking versus feeling first, for example. Thinking and feeling, this one might see clear-cut if you understand the logic that I'm using throughout this video. Thinking is, of course, going to be a little bit more of the yang nature. It's going to be something that's far more hard, masculine, and unmoving than feeling, which tends to be more of that yin, feminine, soft nature. This is pretty stereotypical when we look at functions and how they portray themselves. Thinking is, of course, going to be the one that's a little bit more pushy. It doesn't account for the feelings of other people. It's going to be less malleable, while feeling is going to be the function that is more malleable in relation to other people, their needs, their desires, these sorts of things. Now, the one that's a little bit harder to differentiate is intuition and sensing. Now, when I think of intuition and sensing, I think of sensing as the function that's more so associated with reality, being kind of in the moment, the ability to understand and interact with the physical environment. Well, intuition is something that's a little bit more it's going to be a little bit more detached, a little bit more imagination-based. It's not going to be as interactive with the actual moment. I believe that sensing is a far better representation of yang, hardness, masculinity than intuition. And I believe that intuition is a great representation of the yin nature. It's going to be something that's soft, malleable, and more so moving than sensing. When we look at sensing types, they're usually very matter of fact. If something goes against how they understand things on a factual level, then they're going to be a little bit unmoving in how they approach those certain topics. Whereas intuitive types usually like to find workarounds with things, and they don't care if the facts lead and match up to what they want in the situation. They're going to be someone who is a little bit more moving when it comes to interacting with things in the perceptual realm compared to the sensing types, who prefer things to be the way that they understand them, or at least they should match up to the facts that they're seeing in the moment. Now comes the difficult part, where we're going to combine all of the things that we just discussed into the actual theory itself in relation to the functions and the components that make them up. And the easiest way for me to explain this is to use an example, so I can go through the example with you and you can see the logic that I'm using when explaining a cognitive function. The first function I'm going to discuss is going to be extroverted thinking. Look at extroverted thinking and try to see the components that make it up, the ones that we discussed throughout the video. Extroversion is the first one we need to discuss. And when we discussed extroversion, I talked about the idea that it represents yang or masculinity. Now, for me, I'm going to mark down one M for masculinity. I could do Y, but since both yin and yang start with Y, M is a better or easier way for me to kind of talk about this concept. So I'm going to mark down one M for masculinity because it's an extroverted function. Then I'm going to see, okay, it's a thinking function. And thinking, we decided, is also of a masculine nature. So I'm going to mark down a second M. This is a masculine function. Extroverted thinking is masculine. We could stop there, but there's actually a third layer to this that I believe is extremely important. The extroverted thinking function is, in and of itself, a judging function. It is not a perceiving function, and therefore it has a third layer or attribute of masculinity associated with it. Extroverted thinking is going to be an MMM triple masculine function. It is going to be the most masculine of functions. And you can kind of see this when you look at extroverted thinking as a function and how it's represented in people who are of that type, like ESTJs and ENTJs. They tend to be exceptionally pushy, aggressive, and yang type people. Let's contrast the extroverted thinking function to one that's going to be a little bit more complex, introverted feeling. So introversion is going to be, as we mentioned earlier, it's going to be yin, and I'm going to mark down an F for femininity when we talk about yin functions. Now, introverted feeling is also a feeling function, and we discussed earlier that feeling is of a yin nature, so that's going to be FF or feminine. Now, the difference is that introverted feeling is a judging function because feeling is a rational or judging function. So this means that we're going to mark down an M for masculine. Introverted feeling is a feminine masculine function. So unlike a function that is completely feminine, introverted feeling is going to occasionally have spikes in its masculinity and how it's going to be approaching different situations in relation to its yang or hard nature. It's going to be more often than not of a feminine nature, but you're occasionally going to see spikes in how it approaches situations because of that masculine nature associated with it. Now let's look at the contrast version of this extroverted feeling. So extroverted feeling is extroverted, masculine, feeling, feminine, and it's also a judging function, which is going to be masculine. So then we have a function that is masculine, feminine, masculine. So despite the fact that it is more masculine than feminine, you're occasionally going to see the spike in femininity when you're talking about extroverted feeling compared to, say, introverted feeling, which is going to have more of that feminine nature. Then you're going to see spikes in masculinity or yang nature. You can, of course, do this with all 8 cognitive functions, and I'm not going to go through them verbally, but I'll put a little table up here so you can see which ones are which. It ranges from the most masculine function being extroverted thinking to the most feminine function being introverted intuition. And it's important to remember that when we talk about femininity, when we're talking about functions, we're not talking about traditional femininity or masculinity. We're talking about that yin and yang, hard or soft nature, which tends to encompass those concepts within it. I'm not saying that introverted intuitives are all feminine people. I'm talking about the functions and way that they process things tend to be of that yin or feminine nature. Now, I think that this is the best representation, from my understanding currently, of how functions are actually manifesting when we look at people and their cognition. I believe that functions are innately masculine or innately feminine, and then they don't have extreme malleability when it comes to the certain nature of them as functions. I think that certain systems, like I mentioned objective personality earlier, and I'm not picking on them, but I think that their system doesn't encompass this correctly. I think that functions have some sort of sliding scale in relation to how a function is presenting itself, but I don't think it comes from the masculine or feminine component of it. And that is to say that I think it's more so represented by growth within a function instead of whether or not it is masculine or feminine itself. For example, if we look at extroverted thinking, if I try to call extroverted thinking as a function feminine, I don't think that we would likely see that this makes a lot of sense. If you said feminine extroverted thinking to me, I say, no, I don't think I've really ever seen an extroverted thinking dominant type who is not going to be of a relatively yang or overt nature. If we do see that, it seems to be that it's from a more unhealthy place and that maybe they're withdrawn. It's not of a usual or healthy kind of mindset. I think that functions have certain stages of growth or development. Say, for example, childish to growing to adult to maybe even some sort of paragon or alpha state where they're going to be representing their perfect personality and cognition within the things that they do and how they process information. I know that there was a lot to take in this particular video, and it's kind of something you might have to read over a few times, and I recommend you check out that blog post if you want to see this in written format where you can really look over it and understand it for yourself. The link for that is down in the description box below. This is a topic that if you enjoyed, I'm willing to do another video on because I have another component of this theory, but I don't want to extend this video to like 30 minutes long. And that is how types represent themselves between their top two functions and how this might look when they're in a stress state with their repressed function. So say, for example, let's look at an INTJ. INTJs are a unique type because they lead with introverted intuition, a triple feminine function, but their auxiliary function is extroverted thinking, a triple masculine function. So while they are usually more reserved, malleable, changeable, relaxed when it comes to their personality and their cognition, when they change into that extroverted form, when they start to interact with the outer world, there's an extreme and drastic shift in how they present themselves personality-wise. And some personality types have these more extreme shifts in personality and appearance, while some, with more balanced functions in the function stack, especially the top two, are not going to have this drastic of a change when they switch from introversion to extroversion and how they process information. Alright, so that's all I have for this particular video. If you enjoyed this video and you're interested in hearing more about this theory or seeing that next video on how types might portray themselves in relation to their function, masculinity, or femininity, let me know down in the comment section below, and let me just know what you think of this theory altogether. If you think it's nonsense, feel free to tell me. This is just something that I'm proposing, and I want you to remember that I don't treat this as fact. I treat it as my current working model for understanding how functions portray themselves. If you enjoyed this video, let me know. I would like to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.